Well, beliefs are in the imagination. They're imagined. It's not direct experience. We believe something to be true, but we don't have a direct experience of it being true. So in that sense, it's a living in the imagination, in the imagined world. We either believe something is good or we believe something is bad. We have a positive belief or a negative belief. So all of that prevents us from living in direct experience. And direct experience is where aliveness is. To live without belief.
Yes.
Yes, that's freedom. That's freedom from belief, freedom from the prison of belief, freedom from the prison of our conditioning, because beliefs arise out of conditioning. We are taught, we learn what we believe. Yeah? We create a belief out of our past experience and what we've inherited. So all of that prevents us from living fully here, alive, awake, free. It doesn't make us less intelligent, it makes us more intelligent. Because when we live from belief, we are dragging our past history, we are dragging our inheritance, that which we have inherited as beliefs, into our present moment experience. That's not intelligence. Intelligence is the direct response to reality now, from an unconditioned place, from a place of no belief. Then there is direct experience. When we live from the mind, only through the portal of the mind, then beliefs give us a safety net, a security, as you say, a landing place.
Yeah.
But true living comes from living from openness, not from mind, which is closed. It's closed because it is based on belief, so it has a limit to it. Yeah? It has a boundary to it. Yeah? When we live from openness, there's no boundary. There's no belief to limit it, to limit experience. There's an openness to what is here. But that means there's no safety net. There's no safety net for the mind. The mind has to fall. But that's true living. Yeah, that's true aliveness. When the mind and its holding on to beliefs or thoughts becomes or comes to be seen as a prison, which eventually it does, it's inevitable that the reactivity of the mind and the boundaries of the mind are experienced as a prison, and then we yearn to break free of that prison. Then we can turn our attention to something else, to something that's deeper than that, freer than that, more open than that, more direct than that, more intimate than that. Well, there's many ways to describe it or to point to it, because it reveals itself differently in some ways for different people, for each person, although its essential nature is the same in each person. But the way that it reveals itself can be different in each person. Fundamentally, it's a waking up out of the dream of separation. That there's a me here and a world out there. That there's a me here and a you there. It's the end of inner division. The end of inner conflict, the end of the divided state within.
Could you say something about how awakening occurred or happened or manifested in your lives, your own life?
For me, it was surrender.
Mm.
The path of surrender led to awakening.
Mm.
The surrender was it wasn't a spiritual path I was following. It was simply life itself became my teacher. And I learnt myself that holding on to a positive state of mind, whether it was just feeling good or whether it was through meditation practice, holding on to that and looking for that was a part of the prison. And so I learnt to surrender all attempts to control my experience. So in that there was a surrender to the ongoingness of life, however it revealed itself. And then what happened was that I unexpectedly touched in consciousness a very barren place, a place within that had no meaning, a meaningless place, a dark place, a place of abandonment. Now I'm not talking abandonment in the sense of my parents abandoning me or anybody. Yeah, it wasn't a personal abandonment, it was an existential abandonment. Just this desolate place within that had no end to it. I called it at the time the Valley of Death. It was a place that had no aliveness in it. Now I'd experienced in my youth, in my 20s, periods in which I would come close to suicide. And this reminded me of that. It had a flavour of that, but of course there wasn't any acting out of that. There was much more maturity and consciousness, self-awareness at this point. But the texture of it was the same. And so this time, as it revealed itself, and this happened over a period of months, there came a moment where I just turned towards it instead of turned away from it. In consciousness. Now, on the external level, that manifested as not getting up off the seat. I was sitting at home at the time, and jumping up and making a cup of tea or going into the kitchen and doing something, which is what I would have done. I noticed how that was a distraction, so I just stayed very gently with this very devastating, desolate landscape that opened up. And there was such a deep surrender to it. The surrender being that it felt that I was being swallowed up, if you like, by a black void, a black abyss of emptiness, of annihilation, in which I no longer exist. It's a kind of suicide.
Yeah.
It's a death. And in surrendering to that, I became nothing and I became everything. And that was very unexpected. There was no self, and the self was all. Yeah? There was all oneness, and that was very unexpected. So that was the profound shift. From that point on, and over time, I noticed very clearly that the victim had totally dissolved. The victim being the one who is a victim of her feelings. When she feels good, she feels good. When she feels bad, she does not feel good. Yeah? When she feels good, she feels happy. When she feels bad, when there's a bad feeling or a negative feeling or a dark feeling, she feels unhappy. So her identity is attached to the experience. Therefore, she is a victim of feelings. She's a victim of circumstances. Yeah? So depending on circumstances, she would feel good or bad about herself. all of that stopped. And I noticed how up until that point I'd lived my life as a victim, even though I didn't think of myself as a victim. I was self-sufficient, mature woman in the world. And yet I was a victim of my inner experience. All of that stopped. That's what changed. So there was no aha claiming of awakening or anything. There was just this very beautiful transformation in which I am the totality. I am life. I am love. Not I as a person claiming it, but simply that I and existence are one. We're inseparable. There cannot be anything else. Everything else is an illusion. And that was known from that time on. But then life continued.
But that knowing never left.
No. That knowing never left.
It cannot go.
It cannot go, because it's lived.
Yeah.
It's lived. But it doesn't become a belief.
No.
Yeah? It doesn't translate into a belief.
Or a concept.
Or a concept.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's alive.
It's just lived. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. A death is necessary in awakening. It's the death of the separate self.
Yeah.
It's the death of the self that stands outside of life, stands outside of existence. Yeah? And in that sense is begging for something, begging for love, or begging for a good experience, or begging for happiness. We stand outside of life. But the existential crisis is when we finally surrender. We surrender any attempt for anything to be different. We even surrender the attempt to exist. It's an existential death. Now, we can't make that happen.
No.
We can't force that. There's no method for that. There's no
No.
process for that.
No.
There's only the willingness to meet it when it arises. What I offer is the ongoing invitation to surrender all inner division when it arises in response to life.
Yeah.
That's how we start to purify the layers of the divided state, the layers of reactivity, the layers of conditioned self that rise up and create suffering. That's how we start to purify, so that finally the root of separation, the existential root, can reveal itself, so that the final surrender. But that can't be given. This can be taught, it can be invited, can be pointed to.
The unraveling.
The unraveling, yeah.
Yeah.
So rather than it being a one-time spiritual experience, I invite the ongoing willingness to surrender the tight fist of reactivity, which is where division is and where suffering is. The other part of it is that unless there's a tipping point inside you where the desire to be free of suffering is greater than the need for safety, psychological safety. Unless that tipping point is reached, then we're talking theoretically. Yeah? There needs to be a tipping point inside the individual where the futility of holding on to some kind of psychological safety net and seeking of fulfillment and happiness and love from something outside oneself is seen to be futile. Until that happens, then the shift towards the possibility of surrender isn't available. Yes, it's almost like we have to suffer enough. And I'm not talking about the suffering of circumstances, I'm talking about an inner suffering, a psychological suffering.
You're really a mirror. You sit with people and you feel where they are, you see where they are, you sense where they are, and you reflect back to them where they can transform.
Yeah, I can reflect back not only the truth of their openness, but also their illusory beliefs, their imaginations, their imaginings, so that we can start to burst those bubbles and come to a deeper truth. I also invite people to be tender towards their experience. So as somebody's sharing or speaking about what's the problem in their lives or problems in themselves, why they're suffering, then there is a clear reflection of what is imagined and what is real, and also the invitation to turn towards tenderness, towards their direct experience. And that is something that most people have not been allowed. Because this world and our conditioning teaches us to cover up that tenderness. So it's ongoing, but it's not that we're constantly working on ourselves. It's just that life is unknown and we don't know what is revealed. We don't know what will be revealed next. Maybe there is a loss that has never been experienced before. Maybe there is a calamity that has never been experienced before. Well, there's the invitation to surrender again. But it may be on a deeper and more subtle level. There is a death of self, a death, an annihilation of the ego self, the tight knot of ego self that believes itself to be a separate entity, whilst life and existence seems to be happening out here somewhere. It's a death of that. And in that sense, it is a death into the emptiness, the void, the existential abyss. It's the end of self. But it doesn't end there. At the same time, it's the fullness. The fullness is that I am life.